is a botanist and conservation biologist working for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the Central Experimental Farm in Ottawa. He was trained in botany, ecology, and plant systematics at the University of Guelph and McGill University. He was a field botanist and herbarium curator at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Hamilton, Ontario, and assistant professor of botany at Eastern Kentucky University before joining the AAFC in 2011. He's an adjunct professor at Carleton University and supervises grad students in the Ottawa Carleton Institute of Biology. In this presentation, Tyler will discuss the use of distribution models to reconstruct the 130-year history of dog-strangling vine in North America. Okay, get started.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much for that. This is actually the project. It's the timing worked out nicely. This is the project that led into the work that Maisie was just describing for you. This is a previous master's study led by my student Charla Foster and my collaborator Heather Karuba as well. And this one, we're looking not at a big collection of species, but one in particular, dog-strangling vine, which many of you, maybe all of you, are familiar with as a very aggressive invader, wide variety of habitats, particularly in Ontario and New York, and spreading into other areas in the east and the northeastern US and into Quebec. High ecological impact with very limited control options once it's established. So because of those limited options, AAFC has been involved, not myself directly, but some of my colleagues have been involved in biological control, in particular with the Hypena opulenta moth. And I joined into this project to do some modeling work in order to figure out how far DSV, dog-strangling vine, is likely to continue spreading under current conditions, to get a sense of where it will go under climate change, and then to be able to relate that back to the biological control agent to better inform that program and make sure that those things are matched up well. So as Maisie described, we're using distribution modeling for this. So it's, as she mentioned, we're combining climate data using distribution records from herbaria and iNaturalist to associate the particular observation records from the field, use those to develop response curves, and then we apply those response curves to create suitability maps that we can use then either in the same locations that the models were developed to figure out how far something might extend from its current range, or they can be transferred from one location to another. So we can transfer them from the home range to the invaded range, or we can use them to look within the invaded range at different time periods because we've got climate models that tell us what to expect 50 or 100 years from now, how those distributions might shift. So that's the approach that we're using. There are a lot of challenges with this. There's a lot of assumptions that go into those models. It's hard to validate. We've got so much access to the data we need to create the models. It's very difficult to get out and field test them. It's certainly impossible to field test them in terms of climate change. We can't go into the future to figure these things out. So there's a lot of, we always get an answer, but figuring out if that answer is reliable is a real challenge. And the literature is full of studies that look into different aspects of this to try and nail down the details. So what we did in this particular study is use a historical approach to try and get a sense of how well the models are working and how they've been improving over time for dog-strangling vine. In essence, we're using historical data to predict the current distribution of dog-strangling vine and use that to get a better sense of how climate interacts with or helps regulate the distribution of the species, and then build a baseline that we can then use in follow-ons to look at how things work under different climate change scenarios. So the data that we're working from, we're training the models with historic records using GBIF, which is basically a collection of all the herbarium records, not all, but an increasing proportion of herbarium records are available in this online resource. And for dog-strangling vine in Eastern North America, it goes back about 130 years, which you can see in the blue dots on the left. And then as an independent data set, we're using iNaturalist records, which goes back to about 2010, or at least we're using them from 2010 on. You can see the distributions are not identical, but they match up fairly closely in what's available. And what we did that was, I guess, unusual or hasn't been done very often with these kinds of models is we broke it down into historic segments. So we could look at, well, what happens if we build one of these models with only the data we would have had on hand in 1920, if we could travel backwards in time and do these MaxEnt procedures, and then keep moving forwards to see how things change over time. So this is our first model built from the data. Here you can see 1910, the first records from Toronto, Hamilton, I think that's Rochester, New York, just a handful of records. 10 years later, we have a strange record showing up in Illinois and a few more spreading out. By 1920, we had 24 records, which is enough to start building models. And the model we built is what you see on the left-hand side there. So not surprising, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but it's doing a little loop around Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. That's where the modern hotspot is, and that's where the model predicted there would be a hotspot based probably on the influence of those records from Toronto and Hamilton. So that's good. That's a sign that the model is giving us useful information. It's also showing Ottawa and Montreal, where the species hadn't occurred yet, but we know now it is. So that's good. But it also showed a lot of places where the species, even 100 years later, has yet to show up, like North Carolina, Virginia, Louisiana. So it's over predicting a lot of areas outside of where the plant has got to in the 100 years since. And one of the interesting things here is it may just be making it into Illinois, but this one little outlying record from Illinois has had an outsized influence on the models that come out. So if we step forwards now 30 years, we now have 61 records, mostly filling in details around in New York. We've got records showing up in Ottawa for the first time by the 1940. It would probably been there undetected for a few years prior to that, at least. But we can see the influence on the map, and so we're getting less over prediction down in Louisiana, less over prediction in North Carolina, although what looks like over prediction in the mountains of North Carolina, where the species, as far as we know, still hasn't shown up. It doesn't go much further south than the southern border of Pennsylvania. But we're still getting our hot spots, and we're getting clearer patterns showing up around Ottawa and Montreal. Stepping forwards, and I haven't mentioned, but the value at the top, that's a score of the effectiveness of the model compared to the modern data. So as that value gets closer to 1, the models are performing better in a quantitative way. As we stepped into 1980, we've got a much higher density of records showing up in the north shore of Lake Ontario and the south shore of Lake Ontario in New York. And that's giving us a much more focused distribution around the sort of hot spot around the Great Lakes. And it's really faded out from those further south areas. And then looking at the most recent map. So this is herbarium records up to 2010, and it's showing us a very high success rate in that model prediction, with hotspots all around southern Ontario, which if you've driven that area, at least as far as Hamilton, that's where you don't have a hard time finding dog-strangling vine. I think that the current records, or at least when we started this project, the current records came just up to the southern end of Georgian Bay. It's not really abundant in southwestern Ontario, but although there are outlying populations there, so it's spreading into the areas that the map is suggesting. There are records now in Montreal. There have been records in Halifax, and I think there's 1 or 2 in New Brunswick. So those suggestions look like they're fairly reasonable. So what this tells us, and some of these things are pretty self-evident, recent invasions in the first 30 or 50 years after the invasion, before as many numbers have built up, we get very low accuracy in our models. And those models are really highly distorted by a few outliers. When you don't have many records, when we had 24 records in that first model, the single record from Illinois had a big influence. Dog-strangling vine doesn't show up in the herbarium record again at that location, and by the time we get to 2010, there's so many records in other locations that one strange observation doesn't have much influence anymore. It's kind of surprising to me was that those early models over-predicted suitability. Kind of conventional wisdom is that before something expands its range, you're going to have a more limited view of its true distribution, but that turned out to be the opposite, just I think the way the variation in the models worked. And then for established invasions, as the invasion progresses, we get better differentiation of suitable and unsuitable habitat and better protection against weird outlying observations that aren't really reflective of the true distribution of a species or its potential. So, of course, I can tell you more data is better. That won't be helpful to you as field workers if I say, well, if you just give me 30 years, I can give you an even better model. What we really want to know is how much data is enough to make an effective model. And so we can go back, here's one of the figures from Maisie's study. And what we're suggesting is that in the lag phase, we don't have much information to build our models on. We're going to get really inaccurate results. As we go through expansion, we get a better and better coverage with improving model predictions. And then as you get later stage of the invasion, you get the highest accuracy and most useful models coming in. And this is where, again, as Maisie was saying, we're working in environmental space rather than geographic space, which is kind of key. So the numbers that Maisie was talking about, when we shift from geographic space to environmental space, we use this program called EcoSpat. And I won't get into the nuts and bolts, but what this plot shows us is environmental space of the historic records and the current records. And the blue area is the area where there's the environmental conditions occupied both in 1920 and in the current day. And the red is the area that's occupied in the present day, but not in the past. The details aren't super important, but what that allows us to do is we can track how that changes over time. So you can see in 1900, we have a relatively small area of the current distribution occupied by at that historical period. And then as we move along through time, we get bigger and bigger blue blobs, which is showing us how the species is expanding in environmental space. And when we pull out those values, we can see how things are changing over time. So the triangles here show us how the species is expanding its environmental occupancy over time. And it shows us most critically that it reaches basically a equilibrium, or what we're interpreting as equilibrium or near equilibrium, at about 1970, which tells us from that point on, we should have about as good information as we're going to get. And that's what we saw with the model performance doing really well once we got to that point. So there are some caveats there. I mean, it looks like DSV has reached its environmental equilibrium, but we included in this analysis human population density as a measure of disturbance. And so what we might actually be seeing is that it's, and here's EdMaps from recent data. All of our data was from Southern Ontario, or that's as far as things went. We are starting to see dog-strangling vines showing up in isolated populations further north, one way north of Kenora. So whether or not that's we've reached true equilibrium, or the lack of disturbance is just slowing things down, that's something we need to put a bit more time into. And just to summarize quickly, because I think I'm running low on time, models built on recent invasions are going to be misleading, but we can use the invasion rates, those graphs over time, to tell us when we have enough information to start building confident models. And then in interpreting those models, even when we get a really good high-performing model, we need to be vigilant about what the model can and can't do for us and be careful in interpreting. And the next steps for our project, doing some climate projections now that we've got a sense of how the models do and don't work so well for DSV, and extending that to the Hypena distribution for the biocontrol. And then, as Maisie's already talked about, extending this approach to a broader survey of species. And that's the end of that. If you want more detail, this is Charlotte's paper. We've just put that out in the December issue of Ecography. So that's available if you want to see the details. And that's my contact information if you want to contact me. And if I've left you any time, I'm happy for questions. Oops. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Tyler. We have time for one question. Is iNaturalist a reliable modern record for DSV, or could there be factors that make this data unreliable?
Sure. I prefer iNaturalist in some ways. I shouldn't say this as a herbarium curator, but iNaturalist has some advantages over herbarium records, at least over GBIF, in that we can see the image. So for one of the challenges we had with the dog strangling vine is it black or pale? And we can look at the records directly on iNaturalist and confirm, yes, this is pale swallowwort or this is black swallowwort. We didn't do black swallowwort. So we have a chance to correct the identifications. They're also, I mean, they're made on most of those records come from cell phones. So the accuracy of the records in the field is going to be generally higher than someone in 1960 making a record going back, looking at a paper map or whatever. Like I think that the accuracy at that level is, I think, preferable in some ways. There are also challenges because they're not professionals and maybe not the same care is taken. So you have to be aware of, but it's going to be a trade-off. And I think in the herbarium, you have to be aware of the possible issues in the herbarium. And I think that was one of the questions that came up from Maisie. In either case, we may be missing lag periods because no one notices something until it's, so that I'm not sure if I've answered your question or avoided it, but it's a good question. It's something we definitely have to be aware of. But I think in general, I feel pretty confident with the way we are using iNaturalist.
Okay, great. Thank you. Maybe one more just quick question. Do you think we can use the growth phase of a species as a factor when considering management prioritization?
Yes, I do think we can do that. I think that's it's a really useful piece of information that I don't think we've taken advantage of. And now I'm not sure exactly what we should do with it. We were talking about this just prior to the conference, but something that's in that upward trajectory before, as Maisie's graphs were showing it, before it starts to slow down, that's in some ways the big mystery, the big danger zone. It could start slowing down in next year, or it could be on its way to cover the continent. But the amount of uncertainty is going to be greatest on things that are the expansion phase versus the slowing phase. So that might be a warning sign, but we really, honestly have to think a bit more about how to turn that into a management practice or a management decision. But that's the idea. I mean, that's where we're going towards, is trying to get a better sense of how these species move over time and how to best incorporate that into what how you approach prioritizing management and that sort of thing.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tyler.